The doctor stared at my chart for a second too long. Then he looked at me. Then he went quiet. I was sitting on a narrow ER bed in a faded janitor uniform, my hand wrapped in white gauze, my name stitched on my chest in blue thread. Emma, 38 years old, divorced, broke, invisible to almost everyone who passed me in those halls every night. "I need to make a call," he said, his voice careful, controlled. He stepped behind the curtain without explaining anything. No reassurance, no answers. 10 minutes later, 3 specialists walked in. One of them pulled up a chair, folded her hands, and looked at me like my life had just split into a before and an after. "Ma'am," she said softly, "your DNA shows something that shouldn't be possible." I almost laughed. Because 3 months earlier, my ex-husband had left me for a millionaire, sent me a photo from a yacht, and wrote 2 words I still heard in my sleep: "Enjoy poverty." That night, everything he thought he knew about me began to collapse. Before everything collapsed, my life didn't look dramatic. It looked ordinary, and that's why I trusted it. I met Daniel Carter when I was 22, during a time when I still believed love was something you built patiently, like a house that grew stronger with every year you stayed inside it. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. But he spoke with confidence, and back then, confidence felt like protection. "You and me," he said once, wrapping his arm around my shoulders as we stood outside a small diner after our 3rd date. "We'll build something real, not like everyone else." I wanted that more than anything, to build something real. We married 2 years later. No luxury, no excess. Just family, a borrowed venue, and vows that came from a place so sincere it almost hurt to say them out loud. I remember thinking that day, this is it. This is where my life finally settles. For a long time, it did. Daniel chased opportunity, and I made space for it. I worked administrative jobs, flexible ones, so I could be the steady part of our life while he took risks. When his schedule grew unpredictable, I adjusted mine. When his stress followed him home, I absorbed it quietly. That was marriage, I told myself. You carry each other when one of you is tired. I managed the things no one ever thanked me for. The bills that arrived on time. The appointments that never got missed. The emotional maintenance that kept everything running smoothly. When Daniel came home exhausted and silent, I didn't push. I made dinner. I listened when he needed to talk. I stayed quiet when he didn't. People used to tell me how lucky I was. "You're so supportive," one of his colleagues said once at a work event. "Daniel couldn't do what he does without you." I smiled, proud and invisible at the same time. Somewhere in our mid-30s, things began to shift, not suddenly, but subtly, the way a room feels colder before you realize a window is open. Daniel started coming home later. He dressed differently, spoke differently. He stopped sharing ideas and started delivering conclusions. "This is how it has to be now," he'd say. I noticed the phone first. Always face down, always within reach. When I asked about it, he laughed. "You're imagining things, Emma." As I wanted to believe him, I needed to believe him. So I did. One evening, while folding laundry, I asked carefully, "Do you still feel happy? With us?" He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed on his laptop. "Happiness isn't the point," he said. "Progress is." The word stayed with me. Progress. As if love were something you upgraded from. I started to feel like a background detail in my own marriage, necessary, but easily overlooked. Still, I held on. I reminded myself that commitment meant staying even when it felt uncomfortable. That real love wasn't loud. The night everything truly changed, Daniel finally said what had been forming for months. "You've stopped growing," he told me, standing in our kitchen like a stranger. "And I can't afford to stay in one place anymore." I didn't understand yet what he meant. I just knew that while I was still fighting for us, he had already decided I was part of a past he was ready to outgrow, and I had no idea how brutally he was about to prove it. I didn't discover the affair in a dramatic way. There was no screaming phone call, no lipstick on a collar, no hotel receipt left behind by mistake. It revealed itself the way truth often does, quietly, and far too late. Daniel stopped arguing with me. At first, I thought that was a good sign. We used to fight over small things: money, schedules, priorities. Suddenly, he agreed with everything I said. Too easily, too calmly. When I asked where he was going at night, he answered without irritation. Work dinner, client event, networking. He said those words like passwords that ended conversations. The first time I saw Vanessa, it was accidental. I walked into a downtown cafe to drop off paperwork for a temp job I was interviewing for. I recognized Daniel's laugh before I saw him. That laugh used to belong to me. He was sitting by the window, leaning forward, fully present in a way I hadn't seen in months. Across from him sat a woman in a tailored cream coat, her posture relaxed, her smile confident in a way that came from never doubting her place in a room. She touched his wrist when she laughed. He didn't pull away. I stood there longer than I should have, long enough to see the way Daniel looked at her not with curiosity, but with admiration, the kind that says, "I want what you have." I left without saying anything. I told myself I was mistaken. I told myself not to embarrass myself by assuming the worst. That night, I asked him directly, "Who is Vanessa?" He froze for half a second. Just long enough. "She's a client," he said. "Why?" "Do you always hold your clients' hands?" I asked quietly. He sighed, like I was exhausting him. "You're being dramatic." The words stung more than I expected. A week later, he didn't bother lying anymore. "She understands ambition," Daniel said, standing in our bedroom, folding clothes into a suitcase that wasn't his. "She lives in the world I'm moving toward." "And I don't?" I asked. He looked at me with something close to pity. "You're comfortable, Emma. She's driven." Comfortable. Like an old chair you replace once you can afford something better. The divorce paperwork arrived quickly. He'd already spoken to a lawyer. Already planned his exit. I signed because I was too stunned to fight. 3 days after he moved out, my phone buzzed. A photo filled the screen: Daniel on a yacht, his arm around Vanessa, the ocean behind them stretching endlessly blue. Beneath it, 2 words: "Enjoy poverty." I stared at that message until the letters blurred. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. He hadn't just left me. He had decided I was beneath him. I thought the divorce was the bottom. I was wrong. Losing Daniel hurt, but losing my place in the world hurt more. At first, I believed I would recover quickly. I had experience, I had references, I had spent years keeping everything together behind the scenes. I told myself this was just a transition, an uncomfortable pause before stability returned. I updated my resume, sent applications, scheduled interviews. I wore my best blazer, even when the seams felt tight from the weight I'd lost without noticing. The interviews were polite, too polite. "We'll be in touch," they said with rehearsed smiles. They never were. Weeks passed, then months. Savings disappeared faster than I expected. Rent didn't wait. Bills didn't care about emotional exhaustion. I stopped ordering coffee outside. Then I stopped meeting friends. Then I stopped answering their messages altogether because I didn't know how to explain why my life was shrinking so quickly. One afternoon, after another rejection email, I called Daniel. I didn't plan to beg. I just needed clarity. "Did you say something about me?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. There was a pause on the line. Then a laugh, soft, almost amused. "You're imagining things again, Emma," he said. Why would anyone listen to me? But something in his tone told me the truth before I heard it from anyone else. A former colleague finally confirmed it weeks later, lowering his voice like he was sharing a dangerous secret. "People have been warned," he said. "Not officially, just quietly. You're seen as unstable, difficult, not a good fit, unstable." I sat in my kitchen after that call, staring at the wall until the light outside faded. I realized then how fragile reputation really was, how easily it could be dismantled when someone with more power decided you were disposable. When the last of my savings ran out, I took the only job offered to me: night janitor, minimum wage, hospital corridors that never slept. The supervisor barely looked at me when he handed over the uniform. "Just do your work and don't cause problems," he said. I nodded. Causing problems was the last thing I could afford. The nights were long and quiet. I pushed a cart down fluorescent hallways, wiped surfaces no one noticed, and learned how to exist without being acknowledged. Doctors passed me mid-conversation. Nurses stepped around me without slowing down. I became background noise. Sometimes, in the reflection of the glass doors, I barely recognized myself. The woman staring back looked smaller, older, tired in a way sleep didn't fix. One night, while emptying trash near the emergency department, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Another photo. Another reminder of what he thought he'd escaped. I didn't open it this time. I just stood there, holding a mop in a quiet hallway, realizing something painful and strange. I had lost my marriage. I had lost my career. But I hadn't lost myself. Not yet. And I didn't know it then, but this was the lowest point my life would ever reach. If you stay invisible long enough, you start to believe that's all you deserve. The hospital at night had its own rhythm, quiet, mechanical, endlessly indifferent. Machines hummed, shoes squeaked against polished floors. Voices drifted past me like I wasn't there. I learned to move out of the way before anyone asked me to. It was easier that way. My shift started at 10 every night. By midnight, exhaustion settled into my bones. By 3 in the morning, my thoughts became heavier than the cart I pushed down the corridors. I stopped checking mirrors. I didn't need to see what stress and disappointment were doing to my face. My uniform hung looser every week, but I told myself that didn't matter. Nothing about appearance mattered anymore. Survival did. My mother called every day. "Emma, you don't sound like yourself," she said gently. "I'm just tired," I lied. She asked if I needed help. I said no. Pride is a strange thing, it survives even when everything else is gone. I lived in a small studio apartment with thin walls and a window that barely let in light. At night, I lay awake listening to other people's lives bleed through the walls, arguments, laughter, televisions left on too loud. It reminded me that the world hadn't ended. Just my version of it. One night, while cleaning near the ER waiting area, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Daniel. I opened the message against my better judgment. Another photo. Another reminder of how replaceable he believed I was. This time, no words. Just an image meant to speak for him. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Something inside me didn't break. It hardened. I finished my shift, went home, slept for 3 hours, then did it all again. Days blurred together. Weeks passed. I lost track of time. Hope became something abstract, something other people talked about. The night everything changed began like every other night. Routine, predictable, quiet. I was replacing a faulty fixture near a storage room when my hand slipped. Pain flared sharp and sudden, not dramatic, just enough to make me pause. I stared at my hand, surprised by how easily small things could still hurt. A nurse noticed and insisted I go to the ER. "It's policy," she said kindly. I almost refused. I didn't want attention. I didn't want questions, but I followed her anyway. I had no idea that decision, small, ordinary, reluctant, was about to pull my life out of the darkness I'd been living in. I sat on that ER bed thinking this was just another inconvenience. I didn't yet know it was the beginning of everything. The ER room felt colder than the rest of the hospital. Even after the nurse closed the curtain, I sat on the narrow bed, my injured hand resting on a disposable sheet, trying not to think about how strange it felt to be on this side of the room for once. The doctor introduced himself as Dr. Michael Harris. He was calm, efficient, the kind of man who spoke carefully, as if every word mattered. "This shouldn't take long," he said while examining my hand. "We'll clean it, close it up, and run a few standard tests. Just routine." Routine. I clung to that word. As he worked, I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted them, a habit I'd developed during long nights when anxiety wouldn't let me sleep. I told myself this was nothing. Just another inconvenience in a life full of them. When Dr. Harris finished, he stepped back and removed his gloves. "You lost more blood than I expected," he said. "We'll run labs, just to be safe." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't care. An hour later, he came back. And something was wrong. He didn't smile. He didn't sit down. He stared at the chart in his hands like it was written in a language he didn't recognize. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt exposed. "I need to make a call," he said quietly. That was it. No explanation, no reassurance. He stepped outside the curtain, leaving it half open. I watched his shadow move across the frosted glass. I watched him rub his forehead, pace once, then lift his phone. Minutes passed. My heart began to race. filling the silence with questions I didn't want to ask. Was I sick? Had they found something serious? Had my body finally given up the same way my life had? When the curtain opened again, Dr. Harris wasn't alone. 3 other doctors walked in with him, 2 men and a woman, all older, all wearing expressions that made my stomach drop. The woman stepped forward first. "I'm Dr. Susan Miller, head of genetic medicine," she said gently. "Emma, we'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's all right. Taken stating dispeces. Taken stat of beings until 10. Genetic medicine." The words didn't make sense. "This isn't about an illness," she continued, as if reading my thoughts. "But we found something in your blood work that raised a flag in our system." "A flag?" I repeated. She nodded slowly. "Markers we rarely see. Markers tied to a very specific family line." The room felt smaller. My ears rang. "I don't understand," I said. "I'm just a janitor. There has to be a mistake." Dr. Miller pulled up a chair and sat down so we were eye level. "Emma," she said carefully, "was your father adopted?" The question hit me harder than anything else that night. "Yes," I answered. "He was adopted as a baby." "Why?" She exchanged a glance with the other doctors. "Because, according to your DNA," she said, "you're related to a family whose medical records are monitored closely due to their history and their contributions to this hospital." My mouth went dry. "What family?" She took a breath. "The Whitmore family." The name landed like a physical weight. I'd seen it on buildings, on scholarship plaques, on news articles about philanthropy and generational wealth. "That's impossible," I whispered. "They don't have any heirs." Dr. Miller nodded. "That's what the public believes." My hands began to shake, not from fear, but from the sudden, terrifying sense that the ground beneath my life was shifting. "Emma," she said softly, "based on multiple tests, run independently, you are the biological granddaughter of Henry Whitmore." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "No," I said. "You're wrong. My father worked his entire life in a factory. He died thinking he was nobody." Her eyes softened. "He wasn't nobody. He just never knew who he truly was." The room blurred. I thought of Daniel's text. The yacht. The words "enjoy poverty" echoing in my head. I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was unbearable not to. 3 months earlier, I had been scrubbing floors, believing I was disposable. And now, in a quiet ER room, surrounded by strangers who suddenly treated me like something fragile and important, I realized the truth was far bigger than revenge. My life hadn't ended when Daniel left. It had been waiting, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life without permission. First came the tests, then more tests. Different labs, different doctors. Each one confirmed the same impossible truth. No matter how many times I asked, no matter how desperately I hoped someone would say there had been a mistake, the answers never changed. I was who they said I was. The hospital's legal department contacted me before I'd even processed the words "biological granddaughter." They spoke carefully, deliberately, as if afraid that one wrong sentence might shatter me. "This doesn't mean you have to do anything right now," the attorney explained. "Your privacy is protected. You have rights." Rights? It had been a long time since anyone talked to me about those. Within a week, a quiet legal team assembled around me. DNA verification, sealed adoption records, court filings. Every step was methodical, documented, and restrained. There were no dramatic announcements, no headlines, yet just a slow, inevitable unfolding. I kept going to work. I still put on the janitor uniform at night. Still pushed the cart through hallways where no one knew what was happening behind the scenes. There was something grounding about the routine, something that reminded me who I had been before my name meant anything to anyone. One night, my phone buzzed while I was on break. A message from Daniel. "I heard something strange today," it read. "Call me." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I locked my phone and put it back in my pocket. He didn't deserve answers yet. 2 weeks later, the news broke quietly at first. A legal notice, a financial publication. Then whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into headlines. A missing heir, a sealed adoption, a woman no one had noticed. Reporters called. Emails flooded in. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly remembered my name. Daniel called again. And again. I always believed in you, his voicemail said once. We should talk. I deleted it. Because belief after the fact isn't loyalty. It's convenience. The court proceedings were calm, almost anticlimactic. The law doesn't shout. It confirms. It verifies. It decides. And when the ruling came down, it wasn't loud. It was final. I sat in a quiet conference room, hands folded in my lap, as a judge confirmed what the DNA had already proven. The Whitmore estate, long believed to have no living heirs, now had one: me. As I walked out of the building, the air felt different, lighter. Not because of the money, but because for the first time in months, I wasn't bracing for the next loss. That night, I stood alone in my apartment and let myself cry, not from pain, but from release. I hadn't been saved by luck. I had been protected by truth, by law, by a system that when it finally saw me did its job. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty settled in. The people who had treated me as disposable were about to learn something important. I was no longer invisible. People expected fireworks after the ruling. They expected me to disappear into wealth, to rewrite my life overnight, to punish everyone who had ever looked past me. That wasn't what happened. The first thing I did was nothing. I didn't give interviews. I didn't post statements. I didn't correct the headlines that got my story wrong. I let the lawyers handle the noise while I stayed silent. Silence, I learned, made people uncomfortable. They didn't know where to place me without a reaction. Daniel tried harder. He showed up where I lived, left messages with my attorney, sent emails that started with, "I've been thinking a lot," and ended with, "We made mistakes." As if betrayal were a shared decision. One afternoon, my lawyer asked gently, "Do you want us to respond on your behalf?" I shook my head. No, because responding would mean reopening something I had already survived. Instead, I focused on control, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I funded legal aid organizations that protected people who'd been pushed out quietly, the way I had been. I invested in compliance reviews at companies known for informal blacklisting practices, not accusations, audits, oversight, transparency, things that leave paper trails. Daniel lost his job 6 months later. Not publicly, not dramatically, just a contract that wasn't renewed, a board that decided he was no longer worth the risk. Vanessa left soon after. Ambition is attractive until it stops paying. Daniel sent one last message: "I never meant to hurt you." I read it once. Then I blocked his number. That was the only response he ever got. The strangest part wasn't watching his life unravel, it was realizing I felt nothing while it happened. No satisfaction, no bitterness, just distance. Because the opposite of revenge isn't forgiveness, it's indifference. I moved out of my studio apartment quietly, bought a modest home in a neighborhood where no one cared about last names. I kept my routines, morning walks, grocery shopping, evenings that belonged to me. For the first time in years, my life wasn't built around someone else's ambition. It was built around my own peace, and that was the real victory. Not that I had more than the people who hurt me, but that I no longer needed anything from them at all. People still ask me what it felt like to go from nothing to everything. They want a transformation story that fits neatly into a headline. I never know how to answer them. Because money didn't save me. It only removed the noise. What saved me was the months no one saw, the nights I showed up to work when I wanted to disappear, the mornings I got up with no guarantee that things would improve. What saved me was learning that dignity doesn't come from being chosen, admired, or upgraded. It comes from enduring, without losing yourself. I think about the woman I was when Daniel sent that text. The one sitting alone in a dark apartment, believing his words defined her worth. I wish I could reach back and tell her something simple. This isn't the end. This is the part where you survive. Today, I use my resources carefully. I support hospitals, legal advocacy groups, and education programs, especially for women who've been quietly pushed aside and told they don't matter. I don't announce it. I don't need credit. I visit my mother every Sunday. We talk about ordinary things. She still holds my hand sometimes, like she's making sure I'm real. I live a quiet life now, a full one, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. When someone tells you to enjoy poverty, they're really revealing their own emptiness. Because losing everything doesn't make you weak. It shows you exactly who you are and who you no longer need to be.